this is Dan Ferrisi, Editor-in-Chief with Commercial Integrator and host of the AV Plus podcast, welcoming you to AV Plus, the podcast for the commercial AV integration industry. We're really excited to be joined today by Mike Casper, who is CEO of Azumo, and the topic of discussion today is the supply chain. It should be a fascinating discussion. We're really excited to have Mike here today.
Yeah, Dan, nice to meet you, and thanks for having me here today. Excited to talk to you about all things supply chain.
As always, please like and subscribe to our YouTube page, and please subscribe to the AV Plus podcast on Apple and on Spotify. Absolutely. The supply chain is obviously a very topical area and has been for several months and really more than a year as far as the commercial AV industry and AV practitioners go. So there's a lot to dig into. I know it's top of mind for many, many integration business owners. Do you want to start by giving us kind of a top line assessment of where we stand in the supply chain crisis? Obviously, it seemed to have been spurred by the COVID-19 pandemic and various issues springing therefrom. Even though the pandemic has largely receded into the background for most of our lives these days, at least here in North America, that the supply chain problems are still lingering. So why don't we start with your top line assessment?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think while we're out of the dire straits that we were in, during COVID initially, which was obviously really challenging for a lot of folks, we're heading in the right direction. I'd say we're still not out of the weeds for the most part. We're still dealing with, especially in some specific areas in the electronic space, semiconductors and the like, still dealing with issues of shortages. And but at least now we're at least seeing things more opening up and excess supply. I think we're going to start running into some interesting dynamics in 2023, where we may be running into some excess supply of certain components. Again, it's particularly focused in semiconductors and other areas too, but it'll be really interesting to see how everyone manages both the economic headwinds as well as some of the supply opening back up again next year.
An excess of supply would certainly be a unique change of pace for us, given what we've dealt with lately. And we recently did a survey in partnership with NSCA, talking about the supply chain specifically, and integrators that we spoke to for that. And it's a relatively small sample size, but yet a pretty good cross section of the integration community are actually even more bearish than what you kind of alluded to. Some people said that they didn't think their supply lines would be fully back to where they expected them to be and where their clients expected them to be for another year or two, maybe three or beyond. They were fairly pessimistic about getting back to the lead times of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 weeks. Do you think that they have just cause for that pessimism, or do you feel like it could be a little bit better than they're thinking right now?
Yeah, I think it's so, in my mind, it's so specific on certain components. Where I was going more on the excess angle is more like in the LCD industry, for example, where there was a huge demand spike during COVID, and that caused a lot of lines to get picked up and to start producing a lot of these LCDs, where now I think you're starting to see there is excess supply out there and prices are starting to drop again in that particular industry. So I do think it's very specific to given components and what the dynamics have been over the last 18, 24 months. I do think, there will be certain areas that, especially as there's some major drawbacks and pullbacks on purchasing side of things with the recession that's looming here, that you're probably going to start seeing some excess inventory faster than what some folks had predicted previously.
And that's a very good point, because there are a whole lot of people that are concerned about the possibility of a recession. There are others who think the Fed may be able to pull off the quote unquote soft landing or something approximating it. But at the same time, when you're trying to throttle economic growth, it's always a very delicate dance to avoid throttling it so much that it pushes you into negative growth or actually, a shrinking of the economy. What do you think the real prospects are of a recession coming into 2023 and beyond? And do you feel like if there is a recession, it's going to be Fed policy induced? Do you feel like this is something that is kind of a man-made creation?
Yeah, I do think it's very likely that we're gonna see this. I think it's very unlikely we're gonna have a soft landing from the Fed side, and I do think it is predicated by this by the Fed. I don't see prices coming down, to be honest. I think where we've now gotten stuck into this inflation period that is going to stay fairly high. And both consumers and just businesses purchasing are getting used to these high prices. And I don't see those going away anytime soon, especially with the economic headwinds and some of the stock prices dropping. It's gonna be really hard for a lot of these producers to give up on this excess margin that they've been able to justify by some price increases over the last 18 months. It's gonna be an interesting year ahead, and hopefully it doesn't last too long.
Yeah, I certainly hope not. Right as I'm, doing this interview, taping this interview, I'm in the midst of working on my State of the Industry report, which is also done in consultation and partnership with NSCA, and talking about interest rates and those kind of macroeconomic factors. They really weigh incredibly on integrators' businesses. Obviously, as you well know, integrators largely, depend on their lines of credit, and if their interest rates are going up from, X% to doubling or tripling or whatever the case is, much like with a mortgage rate or something like that, it's just a whole lot more interest that those integrators are having to bear, in addition to everything else that's going up in terms of the price books and shipping and fuel surcharges and all the other factors that they need to weigh into the true project costs before they can figure out, well, what can I sell my services for? What can I bid on a project for and still make money? And that's a moving target every day and every week.
Right. No, I completely agree.
Hopefully we can get into some of those areas as far as how integrators can optimize their positioning and optimize their ability to withstand, whether it's a recession, whether it's a lingering supply chain issues, et cetera. But let's stick to the supply chain for now, because I know that that's an area that you have real expertise in. And I think one of the things that you espouse, and let me know if I'm wrong, is the idea of manufacturers diversifying their operations, especially looking at North America, for example. Not that they want to get rid of their strongholds in Asia and elsewhere, but diversifying manufacturing operations so that they're less dependent on the logistics channels and other kinds of things that can be so ensnarled in the supply chain.
Yeah, and I think it was an eye-opening moment for everybody, really witnessing that firsthand, where we couldn't travel, especially for those of us that had supply based in Asia or other global locations. We, for example, had some in North America and some in Asia, and how quickly we were able to divert our attention to the North America based ones purely because our team could travel there. And so I think if it was a one-off shock, and things opened up right away, it would be one thing. But the fact that we all had to go through this, and I think when you look at kind of two different business models where products that were being produced and have been out in the industry for many, many years, supply chains very well established, where it didn't require teams to be traveling and working firsthand in person with those suppliers. They were dealing with one set of challenges. The other side of the coin, though, is where anybody working on any new product developments or new product introductions, where you can't really manage that remotely. You're working through a lot of day-to-day challenges with speccing new components in and testing them out and making sure they hit certain validation points. And that for us, was a huge step back, where we had to say, look, we're starting to switch partners now and can only work with those in North America during new product introduction phase, because we had to have that face-to-face and working side by side, working through some of those challenges. So I think there's some big decisions, and I think the bigger bets that were made by companies that have had well-established supply chains and well-established suppliers, primarily in China, where they had to make a hard decision and really place some future bets on what they were going to do with that existing product supply. And then there were others where, looking at any new product introductions, being more flexible and adapting, seeing a lot of that move back into North America for, at least for North America-based companies like ours.
Right. So it's really interesting, because for so many decades we've seen, outsourcing in terms of manufacturing and assembly, and just the idea that you can do things much more affordably, much more economically if you outsource, whether it's to Mexico or to Asia, wherever the case might be. But you make a very good point, which is especially for those new models, those new SKUs, the new innovation, where you really want to have your hands on the manufacturing, the hands on the assembly, make sure things are being created to spec and to your own expectations, your own standards, your own brand equity. insourcing does seem in some ways to be the order of the day. I know it's probably more expensive to insource in that way, but what is the price of a company's brand equity? What is the price of a company's being able to fulfill on the vision that they're setting forth for their new offerings?
You're exactly right. And even, you're starting to see prices almost get on par anyway. I think a lot of companies haven't looked at, a true cost breakdown in maybe a decade or so. And back then, there was some pretty clear price advantages in certain offshoring activities. Whereas now you actually look at it again today with how prices have started to come in parity with each other beyond just the brand equity value that you're saving, if you will, but the sheer just travel time and design time spent within your own team can start to add up to the point where it's not necessarily as expensive anymore as maybe it was 10 years ago.
And I think that that's an important reality to keep in mind. Integrators talk all the time about their true project cost, the idea that you have so many things you need to unfold to figure out what the real cost for project is, inclusive. And I think if you think about outsourcing versus insourcing, you do have to think about all of those multifarious factors that weigh in, including, sending executives and other personnel overseas to go to these factories, whether, shipping, fuel surcharges, freight, the idea that ships might be delayed or might be backed up in port, and then you have to wait, you can't fulfill orders on time. There are so many factors that have to come into mind other than simply what is the wage per hour per employee or something like that. There's a lot more to it than that, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the cost of poor quality continues to add up too, where it's almost this hidden cost that sometimes, isn't black and white right at that exact moment of doing the cost analysis, but it may actually show up 6 months, 9 months, 12 months later, where you didn't realize maybe you were getting parts from a supplier that wasn't as strong quality check, some of the quality check requirements as they once were, knowing that you could show up any given day. We're now knowing that, hey, maybe these guys aren't checking in as much, or how can they completely validate everything? They're starting to slip in some lower quality and lowering some of those thresholds that you wouldn't end up seeing until a final defect might hit 9 months after you ship to a customer. So it is that cost of poor quality that is really, really hard to, put a black and white dollar sign on immediately, that could have some long-term effects down the road too.
Unfortunately, there's a lot of global turmoil in the world right now. I don't mean just Russia and Ukraine, but also there's ongoing strife in China right now, and COVID is continuing to be a problem in that country. There could well be travel restrictions and other kinds of difficulties with moving people and items. So, what is your feeling about China in particular? And I don't want to get into politics or anything like that, but there does seem to be more strife there these days. Do you think that might hasten some of these concerns about, I don't want my factories, I don't want my components, I don't want my gear to be tied up in a country that potentially is going to be difficult as far as transit moving forward?
I think it's one of the most critical decisions that anybody in a leadership position that's overseeing supply chain, it's one of the most critical decisions I think we're all going to have to face here, and will really set the tone for the next 5-10 years. So I think it'll be interesting to see, who wins and loses with some of these decisions that are coming up. It does seem like you can take a couple different paths, and it's probably, very particular to your position in the value chain for all the listeners out there. But our sense is that, you either completely get out of China and say, all right, we're going to go find suppliers and set up, key steps in our supply chain elsewhere. Which then again, depending on, certain technologies, certain manufacturing, primarily is only done in China. For example, LCDs, there's about 75% of the world's LCD products are manufactured in China. So it's going to be hard to find an alternate source if that's a key component in your supply chain. But, that's one option. You say, hey, I'm going to completely get out of China. Another option is, doubling down. There are certain, the market within China, and especially as they're shifting more to consumer-based products with their large population and their economic growth that they've seen, there's a huge opportunity there too, where depending on the market, depending on your business model, we're seeing some companies double down with their operations within China and saying, hey, we're gonna really go after this. Again, you're going to see completely diverging options here. And I think are going to be critical decisions that business leaders are going to have to make. And we'll be curious to see how this pans out over the next 5-10 years. These are going to be some decisions that are going to be really hard to unwind one way or another.
I agree completely. I think this decade will be fascinating as we see companies make those choices and decide whether China is going to be a strategic partner with whom and with which they invest moving forward, or whether they really start to delve more deeply into alternate options. And I would imagine, as you said, kind of the calculation is going to be different depending on the technology in which you specialize and what your company's core values are, what you want to do, what your vision of the world is. But it will be fascinating to see how it shakes out. Continuing though with the supply chain and kind of mitigation factors, things that we can do to try to resolve or at least mitigate the challenges we're dealing with as a result of the supply chain. One thing I believe that you're an expositor of, and let me know if I'm wrong, is kind of the idea of automating assembly processes and the benefits that could be derived from that. Tell me a little bit about why you think that potentially could help mitigate some of the challenges with which we're all dealing.
Yeah, I think, on one angle, so automation, I think bar none is the wave of the future. And we're seeing it with Industry 4.0 and have for quite some time now. So that trend is already happening. Where it can really help is around quality control. I think number one, where if the automation of whatever manufacturing step is critical for you, especially if you're in control of the design of that automation. Your engineers or your key team leaders, as long as you're not throwing that over the fence and having somebody else stay in charge of that automation, controlling that helps keep an eye on quality, no matter where in the world the actual automation is happening. And so, starting there is, I think, step number one, and is a key decision point, that you want to have control of the design of the automation and of the process so that you're not beholden to any one particular supplier in one location. And then two, that'll really just ensure that the quality is there. Obviously, that comes at a cost, because if you're controlling the automation yourself and designing yourself, some pretty hefty upfront costs that you have to bear yourself, versus an easy answer is, let's pass over the automation to our supplier or some of our other supply chain partners. They can bear that upfront cost, but then you're going to be stuck in a situation where they control the automation, and it's going to be really hard to move it out of that location. And so with technologies today and in a lot of the software systems in place, the world is really an oyster in terms of how you different structures and how you can implement the automation. But I would recommend just making sure that you're in control of it, so that at any point you could move it as needed. Again, if you can afford it and can bear that upfront cost.
That whole idea of being beholden to any kind of a third party is particularly resonant, because you hear it all the time with integrators. I speak to every day, and they talk about it with regard to their suppliers. The idea that if a supplier has lead times of 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, that it handcuffs them to some extent, because they can't effectuate their systems, and until the system is fully effectuated, in many cases they can't get paid. So their cash flow is tied up by virtue of the fact that they're beholden to that particular supplier. But it's interesting to think from the supplier side as well, if they have partners in terms of factories and components and assembly, and those partners own the automation, those partners have all kind of the infrastructure to bring about the solutions, then in a very real way, the vendors themselves are beholden, and they're in exactly the same kind of a handcuff state. So I think what you're articulating really is the virtues, even if it is an upfront expense, of unshackling yourself from being dependent on others. Is that kind of the thrust of it?
Yeah, exactly. And at some point, right, the finance group is going to make a decision one way or another. What if we brought that automation in-house? Because now suddenly, if you're automating, in theory, on one end of the spectrum, it could be lights out automation, where you don't have to pay for all the overhead of employees and the labor costs associated with it. So then, does it matter where that's located? Now at some point you could start looking at a make versus buy scenario, where if you control the automation, you can decide where that's located, and suddenly costs aren't that much different, depending if it's located under your own roof or somewhere nearby versus halfway around the globe elsewhere.
So in terms of other kind of risk mitigation strategies or way to minimize the harm that the supply chain causes, another note that I have is that you're an expositor of or a proponent of kind of forming partnerships with some larger scale manufacturers, trying to partner your way out of the issue, or at least use that as a way to maintain a relative strength until the broader macroeconomic and supply chain landscape is more favorable. What is your vision? What is your articulation of this idea of partnership with large scale manufacturers?
Yeah, I think that's where, kind of twofold. One, as we know, there are some critical materials and technologies within the broader electronics industry where it is controlled by a couple key players and they carry a lot of weight. And so in some instances, you're not going to be able to avoid working with the biggest players out there. And on that vein, you wanna almost have their global cachet so that their sub suppliers, you can leverage their weight and can almost have that big brother approach where now suddenly they can make a phone call and help push initiatives. Whereas if you're a smaller company and you try to directly go after those raw subcomponents, they're not going to pick up the phone, or you're going to get put in the bottom of the list. If you're able to partner with a big player in the space and get their attention, they can start, carrying their weight around for your advantage as well. We've been fortunate enough where, because we're still a fairly small player within the industry, but we found that during some of these economic times in the past, larger companies are willing to start working with, say, maybe somebody that is smaller than they are, because they found either a really big client of theirs had to pull back and cut costs in other areas, and they weren't able to support some of their big projects. And they've been more willing to work with smaller companies. And so I think actually now is a great opportunity for companies out there today. If you're open to and interested in working with some major players, now is actually a great time, because they're probably seeing some of their business go away that they were used to seeing, and they're more willing to backfill that with newer opportunities, fast moving up and comers, innovative partners. They also want to be viewed as an innovative, large supplier in the industry. And so I think now is actually a great opportunity for companies to be exploring that.
And that's, I think, a really interesting point. I've been covering the commercial AV industry and its various permutations for about 18 years. And, we've variously been described as kind of like a cottage industry, a mom and pop industry, the idea that our innovation really kind of comes from the grassroots up. And the idea that there is a potential for some of these smaller, up and coming, very innovative companies to leverage the institutional power of some of these larger manufacturing partners seems to me to have the potential to promise a very, very bright future. Obviously, I have a tremendous amount of respect for the larger names in the business, and they're those large legacy names for a reason. But it's also nice to see smaller up-and-comers being able to draft off some of that and benefit from some of that scale.
No, you put it a great way, and I think that's really where those companies that are willing to open up and find the right partners, those are the ones that see that payoff 5 to 10 years down the road too. Incumbents aren't around for 200 years for a reason most often. If they don't keep innovating, and that goes for big and small, if you don't keep innovating, you're going to find yourself stuck in the past. And I think that's one of the benefits in general with this industry, is that innovation is part of the culture. It's part of the backbone, and for the most part, finding partners and companies to work together on, I think, is an exciting opportunity in this space.
So just to kind of recap a little bit what we have talked about as far as key factors that vendors, integrators, et cetera, can keep in mind about mitigating supply chain risks. You mentioned diversifying manufacturing operations to North America, thinking about not just, for integrators, true project costs, but for vendors, true outsourcing cost, and whether it actually does make more sense to insource and take some of it under your wing directly in North America. Also, the idea of automating assembly processes and keeping those automated assembly processes within your own hands, as opposed to being reliant on a third party who you then are kind of wedded to and dependent upon. And also the idea of forging new partnerships with large scale manufacturers. Is there anything else that you would add in terms of how people in the commercial AV industry can navigate their way through the supply chain crunch until such time, whether it's 6 months from now or 16 months from now, that it really starts to loosen up?
Yeah, I think the only other piece I would add is, just get creative with your partners, with your supply chain partners. I think you're going to find people are more open right now than usual or than historically in terms of getting creative solutions together. They may not be your traditional, supply chain procurement type discussions, but if everybody's willing to get more creative and make sure it's a win-win for both the customer and the supplier, I do think you're going to start to see some unique opportunities that you might not have been able to see or have those discussions with 18 months ago. So in general, just having those creative conversations with those supply chain partners, finding a win-win for the future, I think is going to be an exciting opportunity for 2023.
I think it's exciting to hear about too, because so often when you think about macroeconomic effects, when you think about the possibility of a recession, when you think about interest rates, when you think about supply chain snarls, so often one is tempted to just kind of view oneself as a log or a raft floating around on the tide. You can't really do that much about it. You're just being tossed to and fro by tides that are beyond your control. I think what you're kind of espousing here is, although we can't snap our fingers and just make things be as we wish they were, we actually can make some proactive decisions. We can grab the reins to some extent and not simply be tossed around by the tide, but rather try to move in a direction that potentially at least could yield a better outcome.
Absolutely. And I think you're going to see those companies that are open to that and are leaning in on it are going to be the ones that are going to come out of this recession or pending recession here, the more successful positions. So yeah, I think I know a lot of the overarching discussion is fairly gloomy on the supply chain side of things, but I think in another vein, view it as an opportunistic period of time here as we look ahead into next year.
Well, I mean, they call it like a crucible, right? A trial by fire. You're put into a situation of pressure. You're put into a situation where you're really kind of put to the test. And presumably the best of us come out of it stronger, come out of it more able and more well adapted than we were before. So hopefully that is what this is. These supply chain issues, lingering COVID-19 and pandemic related macroeconomic effects simply will test us and try us and put us in a position where we're even more capable and even more robust for the next challenge.
Agreed. That's what we hope here and wish everyone the best as we all go through this as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for being on the AV Plus podcast. It was very informative. I'm grateful for your time. Thank you for sharing your insight and your wisdom with the AV Plus audience and for educating them and me.
Thank you, Dan. It was great to be here today.
So happy to have been joined by Mike Casper, who is CEO of Azumo. My name is Dan Ferrisi, Editor-in-Chief with Commercial Integrator and host of AV Plus. Please check back on CommercialIntegrator.com each and every Friday for a new edition of the AV Plus podcast, the podcast for the commercial AV integration industry. And please check back on CommercialIntegrator.com each and every day for more thought leadership and provocative, thought-provoking content just like this. Till then, have a great day, and thank you for tuning in.